Super Mario has been one of my favorite video game characters for as long as I can remember. So today I want to bring back that nostalgia with some giant 3D characters from the Mushroom Kingdom. So let's do it. So the first thing I needed to do was resaw some of my stock that was on the thicker side. And this is because I want some varying thicknesses to add more texture to the design. And for this design, I'm going to be using natural wood colors. So all the colors you'll see in the final piece are all naturally there. I'm not dyeing anything or staining anything. That's the actual color of the wood. So with that in mind, I needed to choose some lumbers that were going to give me some options when it came to color. So for this project, I decided to go with maple, walnut, cherry, purple heart, and bloodwood. Oh, and a little canary wood will be in there too. So here I'm just joining one edge and then milling all my lumbers down to the thickest that I can possibly get them right now. This way, again, I have some options when it comes to thickness later on. I wanted to try to vary the blocks as much as possible so that I could really emphasize the texture in the design. I mean, I do know the original NES Mario was pretty flat, but I kind of want these ones to pop off the wall. And honestly, my younger self would have appreciated a 3D Mario. So once I had my sticks all flattened out, I could start cutting out the strips. And here I'm just going to use my table saw along with the feather board to cut out those 1-inch strips. This really helps ensure consistency, which in a project like this is super important. So once I set my fence here, I won't touch it again until all of my strips are cut out. This way, if I'm off a little bit one way or another, all of my strips are off the exact same, and I don't have to worry about trying to fix that mistake later on. Now, one thing I will say about this process is that it was pretty tedious, but should have been a hint for what was to come, but hey, we're already here. So as my man Mario would say, let's go! One thing this did do is give me the opportunity to think about my favorite Super Mario game, which of course I'm going to say is Super Mario for the NES, but I'm sure you have an opinion, so let me know what it is down in the comments. So now that we've sped through the remaining cuts here, I can bring the pieces back over the planer and again vary the heights. Now I'm not going to bore you with this whole process because honestly it did take a little while and it wasn't all that exciting. So just know that my pieces vary in thickness from 1 inch to 1/2 inch and anything in between. The one thing that I did focus on here was to make sure that I had enough material of each thickness that I didn't run out by the end of the project. Having to set all this up to go back and do it again would have me like, oh no. Alright, so with our strips all cut out to their varying thicknesses, I can start working on my main blocks. And for that, I'm going to use my crosscut sled. Now, I chose to use a crosscut sled rather than another jig just because my crosscut sled I know is square, and because it's wide, I have plenty of space to hold these long strips in place. So once I had my setup block in place with the right width, I could get to work. So all I really had to do here was cut out my 1-inch block, then move the stick over and cut it again. And I did this process over and over again for about 1,200 cuts. Now I'm not going to lie, this was definitely the most tedious part of this entire project, but because I'm building 5 different pieces, I had a lot of blocks to cut out. And I made sure to start with my most dense lumbers, because this was a lot of cuts to do on this already used blade, and I wanted to reduce the amount of burning I was going to get. And thankfully, as I made it through this project, I honestly didn't see much burning. Though after all these cuts, this blade definitely deserves a good sharpening. And once I had done a couple passes, I decided it would be best to attach some sort of clamp so that I could hold the pieces down more easily, because using my pencil to hold down the pieces every single time got a little exhausting. And one issue I ran into with my initial setup was that my stop block moved slightly, so my blocks were a little wider than they needed to be. So it was good to have a clamp that I could stick a smaller piece into and trim down if need be. Now one other thing I'll say about this is that when I'm in the shop and I'm having to do repetitive processes like this one, I'd really try to make sure that I'm staying focused, but I also take some breaks. All in all, this process took me about 5.5 hours in the shop, so I definitely made some time for a couple breaks in there. And I may have snuck in a few games on the sticks, but don't tell anybody. So I'll take a small break here and say that if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like. It helps a ton and I really appreciate it. As always, thanks for your support. So from there, all I had left was the cherry blocks. And as you can see by my trusty block counter 5,000, we finally reached our goal of 1,212 blocks. Now I feel it's important to note here that I didn't need 1,212 blocks for this project, but again I wanted to give myself options when it came to laying out these blocks on the final pieces. The more variations I have, the better. And having a dozen or so extra blocks for each lumber type definitely does, which I'll touch on more when we get to the assembly process in a little bit. My next step was to trim out some 1/4 inch MDF that I'm going to use to glue these blocks to. Now originally I thought about gluing this together much like I would a cutting board, but in the interest of saving myself time and sanity, I felt like it'd be a lot easier to glue them to MDF, which in the long run I feel was an excellent decision. Once I had my 5 18 by 18 inch panels, I could go ahead and start laying out the blocks. Now some of my designs require some black blocks, and to accomplish that I'm going to ebonize some walnut. And I'll do that using some iron acetate, which is just some steel wool dissolved in vinegar. Now, I've had this jar for a while now, but if you want to make this for yourself, all you gotta do is mix equal parts steel wool and vinegar together and let them mingle for about a week. So while the iron acetate does its job and brings out the tannins, I can sand all my other blocks down. And once things were nice and peachy, I could start assembling. And being that this is a Mario build, let's start with Mario. So first I used a straight edge to make sure my initial line was, well, straight. Because if we start crooked here, that's just going to set us up for a crooked piece all along the way. And Mario already has enough going on, so I don't think he needs any more added instability. So once I had the first row in place, I just added the rows to it, making sure that my blocks line up with the blocks below or above. And I'm not going to lie, this process took me about a day, which sounds like a long time, and it is. But because I'm staggering them, I had to make sure that they alternated well for each line, which is why I needed those extra blocks. So my process for getting these guys together was essentially just looking at my printout for what blocks I needed for each line, and then gathering the pieces I need and putting them together before actually applying the glue. And if you guys want the templates that I use with the counts for each of the blocks, let me know down in the comments and I'll put a file together and drop it into the description. Plus, as always, I'll let you guys know in the community. Oh, and speaking of community, make sure you hit subscribe. I release new videos all the time on woodworking tips, tricks, and furniture builds, so hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I appreciate your support. Oh, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but the glue I'm using here is just CA glue. It really cuts down on the dry time and makes the assembly process a heck of a lot faster. Plus, these shouldn't see a lot of strain, so it's plenty strong. And with the fire flower finished, I could finally see how the final collection was coming together. And I'll be the first to say that these are looking fantastic. That Toad is such a fun guy. So the next step was to remove the excess MDF so that I had a lot less material to remove over at the router. Now, obviously all these blocks don't line up perfectly, so what I'm left with is a little bit of a staggered edge. And that's okay, I think it adds again to that texture that we're looking for. But here I'm just taking my bandsaw and cutting as close to that staggered edge as I possibly can. And while the question block comes out easily, some of my other characters are a little bit more challenging. But for this process, I'm going to say that Toad was my favorite character. But there's a lot of characters in the Mushroom Kingdom, so let me know what your favorite is down in the comments. Just don't say Daisy. And I'll also say that the most challenging character was probably Mario. And maybe that was due to his purple heart. Denim, denim, denim. Mamma mia, that was a bad joke. But in all actuality, this wasn't that difficult of a process. I was just careful to not cut into any of my blocks. And if I had, I could probably pry it off pretty easily, but thankfully that didn't happen and we didn't have to worry about it. For any of the MDF that was a little too tight or uncomfortable for me to cut out, I just left thin strips so that I could knock them out with my chisel and my pow hammer. Now my fire flower has some inside reliefs that need to be removed, and for that I'll just use my drill and a Forstner bit. That'll leave me with about 1/8 of an inch material remaining, and that'll be easy enough to clean up over at the router table. Now if your drill press is deep enough, I would recommend doing that over there, but my benchtop model isn't, so a hand drill and a plywood backer gets the job done. So next I installed a 1/4 inch flush trim bit over at the router table. Now this is the first video where I'm using my new router table, and I gotta say, this thing is super impressive. Compared to my in-bench solution, this thing is an absolute tank. So if you haven't seen that video yet, be sure to check it out. Alright, so here what I'm going for is obviously a really smooth edge. And like I pointed out earlier, these blocks are a little offset. So they give me a little bit of texture around the edges, which I think really adds to the overall look of these things. But let me know how you think it turned out down in the comments. So the bit I'm using here is an ultimate compression flush trim bit, and this thing chews through MDF like it wasn't even there. So even though in a couple places my MDF is about 1/4 inch in thickness, it's no problem for this bit. I'll leave a link to it down in the description if you want to check it out. And if you enjoy these videos and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, and invites to the Discord server, and some other free stuff. And I'm always looking for new ways to get you guys involved with one-on-ones and Q&As, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, check out the link below. And for those of you who've already joined, thank you so much for your support. It means the world. Doop doop doop. Alright, so next up was to create some mounting blocks, and for that, I'll just use my keyhole bit in the router. So once I plunge the bit into the workpiece, I move it forward about 1/2 inch, wait for the bit to stop, and then I have my keyhole. From there I can take the piece over to my table saw and trim off the block. While I could probably get away with using CA glue to attach these, I went ahead and used Quick and Thick just because it's a little bit stronger. An added plus of using Quick and Thick is that it's an accelerated wood glue, so it dries really quickly, which is great because I can't wait to get the finish on these guys. So once I've attached the upper mounting block, I attach 2 more blocks lower on the piece. This gives me 3 points of contact on the wall and should give me plenty of balance. I did this same out on the modern clock video I did a couple months ago, and that's worked out great. From there, I could slap the Timber Biscuit Woodworks brand onto the back side of all these guys, so if any of my friends try to say it's their Mario, I'll know the truth. You know who you are. From there, it was time for finish. And for the finish on these, I'm just going to use a spray lacquer. Now in the past, I've been a huge proponent of penetrating oils, but for this one, a film finish ought to do just fine. Plus there's a ton of nooks and crannies, so a spray finish is way better for this type of project. Once I had applied 3 coats, I could attach my LED string lights. These will just be a cherry on top of the design and give it some backlighting that I think will look pretty cool. Granted, I've never tested this brand before, so it was kind of a shot in the dark. No pun intended. To attach the switch, I just used some double-sided tape, and to run the string around the perimeter, I just used some staples. I was just really delicate because the wire was super thin. From there, the only thing left to do was flip the switch. Man, I love how these things turned out. They're unleashing a level of nostalgia that I didn't know that I needed in the shop. But I think making the place you work and live more fun is what this stuff's all about. So while I originally planned on giving these to my son, I think I'm going to keep him in the shop for a little while. Maybe I'll let him earn one as a trophy every time he beats me in a game. Though I haven't decided on their final orientation yet, so let me know if you have any ideas. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, make sure you subscribe. Check out this video over here next, and like always, I'll see you next time.